The drought had lasted 3 months. Cattle bones bleached white in the creek bed where water used to run. The sky burned copper every morning, promising heat that never broke. Sarah McKenna had spent the dawn hours hauling buckets from the deep well behind her cabin when she saw the dust cloud rising from the south. Not wind, not a dust devil spinning lazy across the flats. Horses, moving fast, desperate, with purpose that had nothing to do with her small homestead tucked against the Red Rock Canyon walls. She set down the bucket and shaded her eyes. 7 riders, maybe 8, their mounts lathered and stumbling. Apache, she could tell by the way they sat their horses, the way they moved like they were born in the saddle. But something was wrong. They weren't riding in formation. They scattered like birds fleeing a hawk. Behind them, another cloud, bigger, darker, soldiers in blue cutting across the desert like a blade. Sarah didn't hesitate. She grabbed her rifle from beside the door and moved to the shadow of the barn. Her late husband's voice echoed in her memory. Apache don't run unless something's chasing them that's worse than death. The first rider reached her fence line, and his horse went down. Just collapsed, foam on its muzzle, sides heaving like a bellows. The rider rolled, came up running, and that's when Sarah saw what he carried. A bundle against his chest, small, wrapped in deerskin, moving. The Apache warrior looked back once at the approaching dust, then at Sarah's cabin. His eyes found hers across the distance, dark, desperate, human. He made a decision that would change everything. He ran toward her. Sarah lowered her rifle, not from trust, but from instinct. The same instinct that told her when a storm was coming, when the well was about to run dry, when something bigger than fear was walking across her land. The warrior reached the barn, chest heaving. He was young, maybe 25, with a scar that ran from his left ear to his jaw. His buckskin shirt was torn, dark with sweat and something else, blood. He held out the bundle. Sarah stared. Inside the deerskin, a baby, Apache, no more than 6 months old, black hair damp with fever, tiny fists clenched against whatever pain had settled in its bones. A girl, Sarah realized, burning hot to the touch. The warrior spoke. Not in English, not in Spanish. Apache words that meant nothing to Sarah except in the way they sounded. Desperate, pleading. The dust cloud was closer now. Sarah could hear the thunder of hooves, the shouts of soldiers who'd been riding hard under the desert sun. The warrior looked back, then at Sarah, then pressed the baby into her arms. He spoke one word in broken English, hide. Then he ran, not toward his fallen horse, not toward the canyon where he might find cover. He ran east, across the open flat, drawing the soldiers away from her cabin like a wounded bird leading hunters from its nest. Sarah stood frozen, baby in her arms, until she heard the first gunshot. Then the second. Then a volley that echoed off the canyon walls like thunder. Then silence that stretched like wire about to snap. She looked down at the child. The fever was getting worse. The baby's breathing came in short, sharp pulls, like she was drowning in air too thin to hold her. Sarah went inside. The cabin had been her home for 12 years, built by her husband's hands, furnished with care and hope and dreams that died with him in a flash flood 2 springs past. Now it felt different, like it was holding more than one life, more than one story. She laid the baby on her kitchen table and unwrapped the deerskin. The child was tiny, perfect, and burning up. Sarah had delivered 3 babies in her time, lost one of her own, and she knew fever when she saw it. This one was bad. She worked by instinct. Cool water, soft cloths, whispered prayers in a language the child would never understand but might recognize in the tone. The baby's eyes opened once, dark as midnight, wide as the sky, looking at Sarah like she was trying to memorize her face. The fever raged through the night. Sarah didn't sleep, didn't eat, just kept the cool cloths coming, kept her hand on the tiny chest to feel each heartbeat, each breath. Twice the breathing stopped for seconds that felt like hours before starting again with a gasp that made Sarah's own heart skip. At 3 a.m, the baby began to convulse, small tremors that shook her entire frame, her eyes rolling back until only white showed. Sarah had seen this before, in her own child, the one who didn't live to see his first birthday. She knew what it meant, but this time she wouldn't let death win. She stripped the baby naked, wrapped her in cool, wet cloth, and held her skin to skin, the way the Pueblo women had taught her when she first came to this territory. Body heat regulation, they called it. Sometimes the only thing that worked when fever tried to claim the very young. The convulsions stopped. The fever broke at dawn. By morning, Sarah McKenna was no longer alone. She woke to the sound of crying. Not distressed, just awake, hungry, ready for whatever the day would bring. Sarah rose, heated milk from the goat she kept behind the cabin, and fed the child drop by drop from a clean rag. The baby took it eagerly. Her color was better, her breathing even. She looked up at Sarah with those midnight eyes and made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but close enough. Sarah felt something shift in her chest, something she hadn't felt since James died, like the cabin was home again instead of just a place to wait. That afternoon, the questions started. Thomas Brennan rode up first. Her nearest neighbor, 5 miles east, a good man with a family and opinions about Indians that didn't bend with circumstances. He stopped his horse at her fence and called out, "Sarah, you all right? Heard there was Apache trouble yesterday." She came to the door, baby hidden in the back room sleeping in a makeshift crib fashioned from a wooden apple crate lined with her softest blankets. "I'm fine, Thomas. Just a little dust in the air." "More than dust. Cavalry came through chasing a war party. Found blood near your fence line." His eyes narrowed, studying her face like he was reading weather signs. "You see anything?" Sarah kept her voice steady, her hands folded in front of her apron. "Saw some riders. They didn't stop. Soldiers said they cornered most of them near Devil's Canyon. But one got away. Young buck, they figure. Probably wounded." Thomas shifted in his saddle, leather creaking. "You been extra careful? Check your locks at night?" "Always do." Thomas studied her face for a long moment. Behind him, his horse stamped and snorted, eager to be moving in the heat. "Well, you be careful. Apache get desperate when they're cornered. Do things they wouldn't normally do. Like leave their children with white women," Sarah thought but didn't say. "Heard tell this particular band's been raiding south of here. Took some cattle. Maybe worse. Army's got blood up about it." Thomas leaned forward in his saddle. "You need anything, you send word. Martha's got extra preserves if your supplies are running low." "I appreciate that, Thomas. Give my regards to Martha and the children." After he left, Sarah went back inside and found the baby awake, studying the rough wooden ceiling like it held secrets worth discovering. She'd fashioned a more proper feeding arrangement using a clean bottle James had used for medicine, with a piece of soft leather pierced with tiny holes, serving as a makeshift nipple. The baby took to it naturally, her tiny hands grasping at Sarah's fingers while she fed. There was intelligence in those dark eyes, awareness that seemed older than her months. She watched Sarah's face constantly, as if memorizing every line, every expression. That evening, Sarah sat by the fire, baby sleeping against her chest, and tried not to think about what came next. She'd saved the child's life, but for what? To wait for soldiers to come asking harder questions? To eventually hand her over to authorities who'd see her as nothing more than an enemy's offspring? The thought made her arms tighten protectively around the small, warm weight. The second visitor came 2 days later. Lieutenant Morrison, young, serious, dusty from riding hard across territory that didn't forgive mistakes. He dismounted without invitation and approached the cabin with his hand resting on his sidearm. "Ma'am," Lieutenant Morrison, Fort Defiance, "I'm investigating Apache activity in the area." Sarah nodded, stepping out onto the porch but staying close to the door. "Haven't seen much activity." "It's been quiet. We tracked a war party through here 3 days ago. Found signs of a struggle near your property. Blood, tracks, evidence of casualties."
He paused, studying her reaction. "You certain you saw nothing?" "I saw riders in the distance." They didn't approach the cabin. Morrison walked closer to the door, his boots heavy on the wooden steps. "Mind if I look around?" "Just to be thorough." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. In the back room, the baby was sleeping, but babies woke when they wanted to, made noise when they needed something. "I'd rather you didn't. I'm not comfortable with strange men in my home." "I understand your position, ma'am, but this is a military matter. We have reason to believe the Apache may have left something behind." "Like what?" Morrison hesitated, as if debating how much to reveal. "Intelligence suggests they were protecting something valuable. Documents, weapons, maybe captives. One of our scouts found signs that suggest a wounded warrior might have made it this far. Or a baby," Sarah thought. "I've seen nothing like that, Lieutenant." He studied her for a long moment, his young face serious under the brim of his military cap. Behind him, his horse shifted restlessly in the heat, tail switching at flies. "Mrs. McKenna, I have to ask directly. Are you harboring anything or anyone that might be connected to the Apache raid?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Sarah met his gaze steadily. "Lieutenant, I'm a widow trying to survive in hard country. I mind my own business and expect others to do the same." "That's not an answer to my question. It's the only answer I'm prepared to give." Morrison's jaw tightened. "Ma'am, obstruction of a military investigation is a serious matter if you're hiding something, quote."
"Are you threatening me, Lieutenant?" Sarah's voice carried an edge she hadn't used since James died, when she'd had to face down claim jumpers and men who thought a woman alone was easy prey. "I'm trying to do my job, ma'am. 4 soldiers were killed in that raid. Good men with families." Sarah felt the weight of that, the knowledge that her choice to help might be seen as betrayal by those who'd lost husbands, fathers, sons. But in the back room, a baby slept who'd done nothing wrong except be born Apache in a territory where that was enough to make her an enemy. "I'm sorry for your losses, Lieutenant, but I can't help you with something I know nothing about." Morrison stared at her for another long moment, then touched his hat brim. "If you do see anything unusual, anything at all, you send word to the fort immediately. Apache are unpredictable when they're desperate." After he left, Sarah sat in her kitchen and stared at her hands. They were shaking. 4 soldiers dead, a young Apache warrior who'd trusted her with his child also dead, and she was caught in the middle with a baby who represented everything both sides feared about the other. That night, she made a decision that would define the rest of her life. The baby would stay. Days turned to weeks. The child grew stronger, started sleeping through the night, began to recognize Sarah's voice and respond with smiles that could melt stone. Sarah named her Elena, after her own grandmother, who'd come west in a covered wagon and carved a life from unforgiving land. Elena. It meant bright light in Spanish, which seemed fitting for a child who'd brought illumination back to a cabin that had been dark for too long. Sarah learned the rhythm of caring for someone else again. The middle of the night feedings when the desert was cold and still. The constant worry that something might be wrong. The way her heart jumped every time Elena made a sound that might indicate distress. But she also learned joy again. The first real smile. The way Elena's tiny fingers wrapped around her thumb with surprising strength, the soft breathing that meant all was well. She crafted toys from scraps of wood and fabric, carved a teething ring from soft pine, sewed tiny clothes from her own old dresses cut down and hemmed with care. Elena responded to everything with curiosity and delight, studying each new object like it was a wonder beyond imagining. Summer deepened into the kind of heat that made the air shimmer and dance. The drought continued, but Sarah's well held steady, fed by an underground spring James had been clever enough to locate when they'd built the homestead. She rationed water carefully, shared with neighbors when their wells ran dry, and watched Elena grow from a fragile infant into a robust, alert baby who was clearly thriving. But hiding a child was harder than hiding most secrets. Elena had lungs, and she used them. She babbled constantly, a stream of sounds that seemed to contain the seeds of language, even if Sarah couldn't understand what she was trying to communicate. She laughed often, especially when Sarah made faces or played peekaboo with a cloth. And sometimes, when the pain of cutting teeth or the frustration of wanting something she couldn't reach became too much, she cried with the full-throated outrage of the very young. Sarah learned to time her outside work for Elena's nap times, to muffle sound when neighbors might be passing, to have explanations ready for any noise that might carry on the desert air. She told visitors she'd acquired a goat kid that was particularly vocal. She blamed coyotes for sounds that came from the house at night. She became adept at misdirection and half-truths. But she couldn't hide forever. Mrs. Abernathy rode up one morning in late August, while Sarah was weeding her expanded garden. Elena was sleeping inside, but her presence filled the cabin like warmth from a fire, impossible to miss for anyone who knew what to look for. Sarah, dear. Mrs. Abernathy was the closest thing the scattered community had to a social center, a woman who made it her business to know everyone else's business and wasn't shy about sharing her opinions. "How are you managing in this terrible heat?" "Well enough, Mrs. Abernathy." "The well's holding steady." "That's a blessing." "Poor Thompson's went dry last week. Had to drive his cattle 20 miles to water." She peered at Sarah's garden with sharp eyes. "My, you've expanded quite a bit this year. Planning to sell surplus at the trading post?" Sarah kept working, hands steady on the hoe. "Just want to be prepared for whatever comes." "Very wise, though I have to say, dear, you seem different lately. More settled, somehow. There's a contentment about you that wasn't there last spring." Mrs. Abernathy's voice took on the tone of someone fishing for information. "Not seeing someone, are you?" A woman alone needs companionship, especially in this harsh country. "I'm content with my own company, Mrs. Abernathy. Still, it's not natural for a woman to live alone indefinitely. You're young enough yet to remarry, start a family. James wouldn't want you to live like a hermit in his memory." From inside the cabin came a sound that made Sarah's blood freeze. A baby's cry, muffled by walls and distance, but unmistakable to anyone who'd ever heard one. Mrs. Abernathy's head snapped toward the sound. "What was that?" Sarah didn't miss a beat. "That darned goat kid again. Bottle raised, thinks it's a house pet. Gets into everything." Another cry, longer this time, with the particular cadence of a baby who was waking up hungry and wanted immediate attention. "That doesn't sound like any goat I've ever heard," Mrs. Abernathy said suspiciously. "Different breeds make different sounds. This one's got some Spanish goat in it, I think." Sarah leaned on her hoe, projecting calm confidence while her heart hammered. Loud little thing, but it's good company. Mrs. Abernathy studied the cabin with the intensity of a hawk, watching for movement in tall grass. "You wouldn't mind if I took a look, would you?" "I've been thinking of getting some goats myself." "Actually, I would mind. The kid's skittish around strangers. Took weeks to get it settled, and I don't want to upset its routine." The crying stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving only the buzz of insects and the whisper of wind through dry grass. Mrs. Abernathy waited a moment longer, then smiled tightly. "Of course, dear. We all have our ways of doing things." She gathered her reins. "But if you ever need help with anything at all, you know you can come to me." That evening, Sarah paced the cabin with Elena in her arms while the baby fussed and refused to settle. It was as if Elena could sense the tension that had filled the small space, the knowledge that their secret was hanging by threads that were growing thinner with each passing day. "What are we going to do, little one?" Sarah whispered, pressing her lips to the baby's dark hair. "How long can we keep this up?" Elena looked up at her with those serious midnight eyes, reaching one tiny hand to touch Sarah's face. The gesture was so trusting, so innocent of the complications it represented, that Sarah felt tears she'd been holding back for weeks. She'd known from the beginning that this arrangement couldn't last forever. Elena would grow, would become harder to hide, would eventually need things Sarah couldn't provide. But what were the alternatives? Turn her over to authorities who would see her as nothing more than an Apache child, to be shipped off to some distant school where her heritage would be systematically erased? Let her become a ward of the state, lost in a system that had no place for children who didn't fit neat categories. The thought of Elena disappearing into that machinery of forced assimilation made Sarah's arms tighten protectively. Whatever happened, she wouldn't let the baby become just another casualty of a conflict she was too young to understand. That night, Sarah sat by the fire with Elena sleeping peacefully in her lap and made plans. If they couldn't hide forever, she'd have to be smarter about how they lived, more careful about visitors, more creative about explanations, more prepared for questions that would inevitably come. She also began teaching Elena things that might matter someday. Simple words in English, yes, but also the few Apache phrases she'd picked up from trading with peaceful bands in better times. She sang her lullabies in Spanish, told her stories about the desert and its creatures, pointed out the difference between safe plants and dangerous ones during their brief ventures outside. If Elena was going to grow up between worlds, Sarah reasoned, she should have tools to navigate both. Autumn arrived with cooler nights and the promise of relief from the brutal summer heat. Elena had learned to sit up on her own, was experimenting with solid food, and had developed a vocabulary of sounds that Sarah was starting to interpret with reasonable accuracy. She was a happy, healthy baby who clearly trusted the world to provide for her needs. But as the weather changed, so did the level of scrutiny from neighbors and officials. Lieutenant Morrison returned in September, this time with a sergeant and 2 enlisted men. They approached the cabin in formation, a show of official authority that made Sarah's stomach clench with dread. "Mrs. McKenna," Morrison called from horseback, "we need to search your property." Sarah stepped onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron with deliberate calm. Inside, Elena was having her afternoon nap, blissfully unaware of the danger gathering outside. "Do you have a warrant, Lieutenant?" "We have reports of suspicious activity." "Sounds that don't match your explanations. Neighbors are concerned." Morrison dismounted, his face set in official lines. "We're going to search the cabin and outbuildings. You can cooperate, or we can make this difficult." Sarah felt the world narrow to this moment. This choice. She could try to bluff, hope Elena stayed asleep, pray that 4 trained soldiers wouldn't notice signs of a baby's presence, or she could take a different risk. "Lieutenant, before you search my home, I want you to understand something about the kind of man your job makes you." Morrison paused, clearly not expecting philosophy. "Ma'am, there's a story the Apache tell about a warrior who came across a snake frozen in the snow. The snake begged for help, promised it meant no harm, just wanted to live. The warrior picked it up, warmed it by his fire, fed it from his own food. When the snake was strong again, it bit the warrior. As the warrior lay dying, he asked why. The snake said, 'You knew what I was when you picked me up.'" "I'm not sure I understand your point, Mrs. McKenna." Sarah looked each man in the eye. "You're about to search my home for evidence of something you call suspicious activity. Before you do, ask yourself what kind of man searches a widow's house looking for reasons to punish mercy." The sergeant shifted uncomfortably. One of the enlisted men, barely old enough to shave, looked away, but Morrison's face remained hard. "War changes the rules, ma'am. We have responsibilities." "So do I." From inside the cabin, Elena began to cry. Not the angry cry of discomfort, but the lost, frightened sound of a baby waking alone in an unfamiliar place. Sarah closed her eyes briefly, then opened them and met Morrison's stare. "That's not a goat kid," the sergeant said quietly. "No," Sarah replied. "It's not." Morrison drew his service revolver, though he kept it pointed down. "Mrs. McKenna, step away from the door." Sarah didn't move. "Lieutenant, if you go into that cabin, you're going to find a baby." A 7-month-old Apache girl who was dying of fever when her father placed her in my arms and ran toward your guns to lead you away from her. I saved her life. I've cared for her. I've loved her. And now you're going to tell me that makes me a criminal." The silence stretched between them like a rope under tension. Elena's cries grew louder, more insistent. "Where's the father now?" Morrison asked. "Dead. Your soldiers killed him 3 months ago. And you've been harboring an enemy child since then." Sarah's voice turned hard as flint. "I've been raising an orphaned baby. If that makes her an enemy in your eyes, Lieutenant, then you need to ask yourself what kind of war you think you're fighting." Morrison holstered his weapon but kept his hand near it. "Ma'am, I have my orders. That child needs to be turned over to proper authorities." "What proper authorities? Who exactly is equipped to care for an Apache infant? What institution exists that will see her as anything more than a problem to be solved? There are schools that steal children's souls and call it education." Sarah's voice rose. "That punish them for speaking their own language? Beat them for remembering their own families?" Elena's cries reached a pitch that cut through the argument like a blade. Sarah looked toward the sound, her face torn between defiance and maternal concern. "She needs me," Sarah said simply. "She needs to be with her own kind," Morrison replied. "Her kind is anyone who loves her enough to put her welfare first." The standoff stretched on, 4 armed men facing 1 unarmed woman, with a baby's cries providing the only sound that mattered. Finally, the young enlisted man stepped forward. "Lieutenant, sir, maybe there's another way to handle this." Morrison's jaw tightened. "Stand down, Private. Sir, I got a baby sister about that age. If something happened to our folks, I'd want someone to take care of her. Wouldn't matter who, long as they were good to her. This is different." "How, sir?" "Baby's a baby. Don't know nothing about war or raids or any of this. Just knows somebody loves her enough to keep her safe." Sarah felt a flicker of hope. "Lieutenant, let me show you something." Without waiting for permission, she stepped inside. Elena was in her makeshift crib, red-faced from crying, tiny fists waving in distress. When she saw Sarah, she immediately reached up, her cries shifting to the demanding babble that meant, "Pick me up now." Sarah lifted her, and Elena instantly calmed, burying her face against Sarah's neck with the absolute trust of a child who knows she's safe. "This is Elena," Sarah said, stepping back onto the porch. "She's been part of my life for 3 months. She knows my voice, my smell, my heartbeat. I'm the only mother she's ever really known." Elena chose that moment to look up at the soldiers with bright, curious eyes. She babbled something in the sing-song tone that suggested she was trying to communicate, then smiled the devastating smile of a happy baby. The sergeant's expression softened. Even Morrison looked uncomfortable. "She's healthy," Sarah continued. "Happy. Developing normally. She's learning English, but I'm also teaching her a few words of Apache because someday she'll want to know where she came from. I'm not trying to erase her heritage, Lieutenant. I'm trying to give her the chance to choose what she does with it." Elena grabbed at the buttons on Sarah's dress, chattering contentedly. She was the picture of a well-cared-for child, clearly bonded to the woman holding her. "What happens to her if you take her away from me?" Sarah asked quietly. "Where exactly does she go?" Morrison was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had lost some of its official edge. "There are protocols. Procedures. That's not an answer. You know as well as I do that there's no good place for an Apache child in your system. She'll disappear into institutions that will either kill her slowly or turn her into something that can never go home." Elena reached toward the young private, fingers grasping at the bright buttons on his uniform. He leaned closer instinctively, and she grabbed his finger with the iron grip of babies everywhere. "Hey there, little one," he said softly, his official bearing forgotten. "Aren't you a pretty girl?" Elena gurgled with delight, clearly enjoying the attention. "She don't look like no enemy to me, sir," the private said to Morrison. Morrison studied the scene, A baby content in the arms of the only mother she'd known. Soldiers who'd come to arrest criminals but found only a woman caring for an orphaned child. The gap between orders and reality, between policy and humanity. "Mrs. McKenna," he said finally, "I need to know you understand the gravity of your situation. Harboring enemy combatants. She's 7 months old. Is a federal crime. You could be tried for treason." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "Then I guess you'll have to decide what kind of man you want to be, Lieutenant. The kind who protects innocent children, or the kind who punishes women for showing mercy." Another long silence. Elena had grown tired of the buttons and was now trying to grab the sergeant's hat, reaching for it with the single-minded determination of someone who sees something interesting and wants to investigate. "Sir," the sergeant said quietly, maybe we didn't find anything here. Maybe the reports were mistaken." Morrison looked at his men, at Sarah, at Elena, who chose that moment to laugh with pure delight at some private joke only babies understand. "Mrs. McKenna," he said slowly, "you understand that this conversation never happened. You understand that if there are any more reports, any more suspicious activity, I'll have to take official action." Sarah nodded. "I understand. And you understand that if anything happens to that child, if there's any suggestion of mistreatment or neglect, the full weight of the law will come down on you. She'll be loved and protected as long as I draw breath." Morrison holstered his weapon and remounted his horse. His men followed suit, though the young private waved at Elena before settling into his saddle. "Keep her out of sight," Morrison said, "and keep yourself out of trouble." After they rode away, Sarah stood on her porch for a long time, holding Elena while her heart slowly returned to normal rhythm. They'd dodged this bullet, but there would be others. Questions would continue to arise. Suspicions would linger. But for now, Elena was safe. For now, they could continue building the life they'd found together. That night, Sarah sat by the fire and wrote in her journal for the first time since James had died. She wrote about choices and consequences, about love that arrives without permission and changes everything it touches. She wrote about a baby who'd brought light back to a dark house, and about the responsibility that came with protecting innocence in a world determined to destroy it. Elena slept peacefully in her crib, unaware of how close she'd come to losing the only home she'd ever known. In her dreams, perhaps she heard lullabies in languages she was too young to distinguish, felt the warmth of arms that would keep her safe no matter what storms gathered on the horizon. Winter came early that year, but inside the small cabin, surrounded by love and determination, it felt as warm as spring. As autumn deepened toward winter, Sarah developed routines designed to protect their secret while still allowing Elena to grow and develop normally. She took the baby outside during the coolest parts of the day, wrapped in blankets that could muffle sound and obscure her features if other riders appeared on the horizon. Elena thrived on these outdoor excursions. She would sit in Sarah's lap while Sarah tended the garden, reaching for leaves and stones with the fearless curiosity of the very young. Her motor skills were developing rapidly. She could sit steadily without support now, was working on crawling, and had begun to show preferences for certain toys and foods. Sarah crafted a wooden rattle from mesquite wood, carving it smooth and painting it with dyes made from desert plants. Elena loved the sound it made and would shake it enthusiastically while babbling what sounded increasingly like attempts at real words. The first word that was unmistakably English came in October. Mama. Sarah was changing Elena's diaper when the baby looked directly at her and said it clearly. Mama. The word hit Sarah like a physical blow. Not because it was unexpected, babies said mama to whoever cared for them, but because of what it meant. Elena was claiming her, officially and publicly, in the only way a 7-month-old could. Yes, sweetheart, Sarah whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Mama's here. Elena smiled and reached for Sarah's face, her small hands patting Sarah's cheeks, while she repeated the word like a song. Mama, mama, mama. That evening, As Sarah rocked Elena to sleep by the firelight, she found herself wondering about the woman who had given birth to this beautiful child. What had she been like? What hopes had she held for her daughter's future? Would she approve of the life Elena was living now, raised by a white woman in a culture completely different from her own? Sarah had no answers, but she whispered a prayer to Elena's birth mother anyway. A promise that she would honor the child's heritage even while giving her the tools to navigate a world that would see her as an outsider, no matter what she chose. The winter months brought their own challenges. Elena was becoming more active, more vocal, harder to keep quiet during the times when discretion was essential. She'd learned to crawl and was pulling herself upright using furniture, clearly preparing for the monumental step of walking. She was also developing a personality that was uniquely her own. She was fearless in her explorations, determined when she wanted something, and possessed of a laugh that could brighten the darkest day. She was also remarkably social for a baby who'd had limited interaction with people other than Sarah. When visitors came to the door, Elena would perk up at the sound of new voices, clearly wanting to investigate these interesting strangers. Sarah learned to time these visits carefully, ensuring Elena was either napping or occupied with toys in the back room. But babies don't stay babies forever, and Elena was growing into a toddler who had opinions about being confined. The crisis came in February, during one of the worst blizzards in recent memory. Sarah was snowed in for 3 days, which would normally have been a blessing. No visitors, no questions, no need to hide Elena's presence. But on the second day, Elena developed a fever. It started small, just a slight warmth to her skin that Sarah noticed during the morning feeding. By afternoon, Elena was burning up, her breathing shallow and rapid, her normally bright eyes glazed with the particular look that meant serious illness. Sarah had medicine, willow bark tea for fever, herbs for various ailments, but Elena was too young for most adult remedies, and her condition was worsening rapidly. By evening, she was having the same kind of convulsions that had marked her first illness, back when she was a tiny infant, fighting for life. Sarah held her through the night, using the same skin-to-skin contact that had worked before, but Elena wasn't responding the same way. She was bigger now, stronger in some ways, but also more fragile in others. The fever was taking a toll that Sarah wasn't sure she could combat alone. On the third day, with snow still falling and Elena barely conscious, Sarah made a desperate decision. She bundled the baby in every warm thing she could find, saddled her horse, and rode through the blizzard toward the nearest neighbor with medical knowledge. Doc Henley lived 8 miles south, in a cabin that served as the closest thing to a hospital for 50 miles in any direction. He was an older man who'd come west after losing his practice in St. Louis to drink. But he'd stayed sober for 5 years now, and had earned back the trust of the scattered community. Sarah arrived at his cabin more frozen than alive, Elena unresponsive in her arms. Doc Henley took one look at them and pulled Sarah inside without questions. He laid Elena on his examination table and went to work with the efficiency of a man who'd seen every kind of medical emergency the frontier could provide. "How long has she been like this?" he asked, checking Elena's pulse and breathing. 3 days. Started as just a slight fever, got worse fast. Henley nodded, pulling out his stethoscope. Pneumonia, most likely. Common in babies during weather like this. He listened to Elena's chest, his face grave. Her lungs are congested. This is serious. Sarah felt the world tilt. Will she? Too early to tell. But we need to act fast. Henley moved to his medicine cabinet. I'll need to keep her here for a few days, monitor her breathing, administer treatments. You can stay, but you'll need rest yourself, Henley finished, shutting the cabinet with a quiet thud. If you collapse beside her, you'll be no help to anyone. Sarah didn't answer right away. She only tightened her grip on Elena's hand, as though letting go would invite the fever to steal her away. At length she murmured, "I'll manage. Don't ask me to step from her side." Henley studied her in the lamplight. He seemed on the verge of protest, but something in Sarah's eyes, steel and desperation bound together, stilled him. Instead, he pulled a blanket from a shelf and draped it across her shoulders. "Then sit," he said, soft but firm. "Keep her calm. Speak to her, even if she can't answer. The mind sometimes hears when the body's too weak to show it." Sarah nodded faintly. She leaned close to Elena, her lips brushing her ear, and whispered words half prayer, half promise. Elena's chest rose shallowly under the covers, her breath rattling yet steady enough to hold hope. Henley moved about the room, grinding herbs, setting water to steam, scribbling careful notes in his ledger. Outside, the night deepened, and the steady chorus of crickets wrapped the cabin in a fragile stillness. At last, Henley returned to Sarah's side with a small clay bowl, the liquid inside dark and bitter-smelling. "This will ease her lungs if she can take it. We'll try once she stirs again." Sarah lifted her gaze from Elena, eyes red-rimmed but alight with stubbornness. "She'll take it. She'll fight through." Henley gave a slow nod, as though he wished he could borrow even half her conviction. Then he settled into a chair by the fire, the orange glow carving deep shadows into his lined face. For a while, the only sounds were the crackle of flames and Elena's uneven breathing. But the silence was not to last. From the distance came the faint clatter of hooves, slow at first, then growing sharper, nearer. Sarah's heart clenched. She looked to Henley, who had gone still, eyes narrowed toward the door. "Riders," he muttered. "At this hour." Sarah's grip on Elena tightened. Fear swept her chest like a cold wind. The hooves drew closer, the clatter distinct against the hard ground outside Henley's cabin. Sarah's stomach twisted. Whoever came at this hour, under cover of night, came with purpose. She rose halfway from her chair before Henley's hand lifted, steady and warning. "Stay by her," he whispered, voice low and sharp. "Don't move her." "Don't let them near." Sarah sank back beside Elena, though her body trembled with the urge to bolt the door herself. She stroked Elena's fever-warm brow, whispering her name as if that alone could shield her. Henley crossed to the rack by the hearth. From it, he drew down an old rifle, its wood worn smooth, its barrel still oiled and gleaming. He checked the chamber with practiced hands, then moved to the door as the hoofbeats slowed outside. Silence, save for the huff of horses and the restless shift of saddles. Then a voice, male, rough, carrying authority. "Dr. Henley." "Open up." Henley didn't answer right away. He set his back to the door, rifle leveled at the floorboards, and asked in a voice calm but edged, "What's your business this time of night?" "We've come from Fort Connolly," the voice replied. "Orders to search the premises." Sarah's heart lurched. She bent close to Elena, whispering fiercely, "Stay with me, love. Whatever comes, stay with me." Elena stirred faintly, though her eyes remained closed, her breath shallow. Henley's stance didn't waver. "Search? For what?" The reply came quick, rehearsed. "A fugitive. Apache woman. Dangerous." Sarah's throat tightened. She pulled Elena closer, shielding her with her own body as though the frail walls of the cabin could not. Henley's voice dropped lower, cold iron beneath it. "You think I'd harbor such in my home? At this hour? I've patience inside, men. You'll not come trampling through." There was a pause outside, then another voice, younger, uncertain. "Orders say all dwellings, no exceptions." The first man barked. "Enough talk. Open the door." Henley glanced back toward Sarah, his jaw set. "Keep her quiet," he mouthed. Then louder to the men outside, "Stand back!" The door creaked as he drew the bolt, just enough to step through. He pulled it closed behind him, leaving Sarah inside with only the glow of the fire and the ragged sound of Elena's breathing. She held still, straining to catch the words beyond the door. Voices rose, muffled but heated. Boots scraped the porch. Elena stirred suddenly, a low moan slipping her lips. Sarah hushed her quickly, brushing damp hair from her face. "Hush, my heart. Quiet now. They mustn't know outside. The argument sharpened. The older voice cursed. Wood rattled as fists struck the door. Henley's reply came, hard as gunmetal. "You'll not enter while I stand. I've sick folk inside, fever that'll cut a man down quick. You want it, step in and see for yourselves." Silence followed, a long, weighted silence. Then the shuffle of boots retreating from the porch. A muttered exchange, too faint to catch. At last the hoofbeats rose again, fading into the night. Sarah exhaled shakily, realizing she'd been holding her breath until her chest ached. Moments later, the door opened and Henley stepped back inside, rifle still in hand. His face was grim, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of relief. "They've gone." For now, Sarah pressed her lips to Elena's temple, whispering, "Safe." "Safe, love." Henley set the rifle back on its rack with deliberate care, then turned toward Sarah. "They'll be back. Mark me. This was only the first sweep. The fort won't stop till they've proof she's gone or dead." Sarah lifted her chin, fire in her gaze. "Then they'll find neither here." Henley studied her, a long silence stretching between them. At last he gave a small, grim nod. "So be it. But you must know, this path you've set upon, it won't end easy." Sarah looked down at Elena, her expression softening. "Nothing worth keeping ever does." The fire cracked, casting long shadows across the walls. Outside, the night wore thin, and with it, the fragile peace that held them. The dawn crept slow and pale through the cracks in Henley's shutters. The fire had burned low, reduced to glowing embers that pulsed faintly like a tired heart. Sarah had not slept. Her head dipped once or twice, but each time Elena stirred, her eyes flew open, watchful and fierce. Henley rose early, as was his habit, moving about the cabin in quiet efficiency. He ladled water from a basin, poured it over his hands, and scrubbed away the night's dust. His face looked older in the morning light. Lines deepened, shoulders stooped, but his eyes remained sharp. Sarah spoke without looking from Elena. "You think they'll ride again today?" Henley tied his sleeves and nodded once. "Wouldn't doubt it. They'll circle the town first, ask questions, sniff out any place she might have gone. Word will spread, neighbors'll talk." "Then we keep her still," Sarah said. "She won't leave this bed until she's ready." Henley gave her a long look, neither arguing nor agreeing. He gathered a bundle of herbs from the shelf and set them boiling over the fire. The cabin filled with a sharp, resinous scent, biting yet somehow clean. By mid-morning, Elena's fever broke into waves, sweat soaking the blankets, her body shivering with sudden chills. Sarah wiped her with damp cloths, whispering to her through each tremor. When Elena's eyes opened at last, clearer than before, Sarah felt her chest ache with relief. "Water," Elena rasped. Sarah held a cup to her lips, smiling through her tears. "Here." Slow now, Elena drank, coughed, then drank again. She leaned back against the pillows, her gaze flicking between Sarah and Henley. "How long?" "2 nights you've battled," Henley said, "but you're not free of it yet. Best you keep still." Elena's eyes narrowed faintly. "The riders." Sarah hushed her, pressing a finger to her lips. "Don't fret that. You just rest." But Elena shook her head, stubborn even in weakness. "If they come again—" "They already did," Henley cut in. His tone was blunt, but his gaze softened. "I sent them off, but they'll return. You must keep silent still. Fever's our shield, for now. They fear sickness more than any bullet." Elena's lips curved faintly, bitter and amused all at once. "Then let them fear me." Sarah kissed her hand. "They'll never touch you, not while I draw breath." The hours passed heavy with waiting. Outside, the town stirred to life. Wagons creaked, hammers rang from the blacksmiths, voices carried faint on the breeze. Yet every sound seemed edged with suspicion, as though the world beyond Henley's cabin had turned hostile overnight. Near midday, hooves again approached. Slower this time, deliberate. Sarah's heart clenched as the shadow of riders passed across the shutters. Henley moved to the door, rifle in hand. But the knock that followed was not the heavy strike of soldiers. It was lighter, hesitant. "Dr. Henley?" a voice called, familiar. "It's Margaret Dale." Henley lowered the rifle a fraction. He cracked the door open. A woman stood there, bonnet drawn low, basket in her arms. Her eyes darted nervously up and down the empty street before settling on Henley. "Word's gone round," she whispered. "They say you're keeping someone here." Apache Henley's jaw tightened. "And what is it you say, Margaret?" The woman's gaze wavered, then softened. She lifted the basket. "I say fever needs broth, not bullets. I brought chicken stock, some bread. For your patient." Henley studied her a moment longer before opening the door wider. "Quick then!" Inside, Sarah rose as Margaret entered, her relief plain. "Thank you," she said, voice trembling. Margaret offered a faint smile. "Don't thank me. Just keep her safe. They're stirring the town something fierce. Men looking to prove themselves loyal to the fort. Best you keep your heads down." She set the basket on the table and touched Sarah's arm gently. "You've a brave heart. Don't let it break you." Then, without waiting for reply, she slipped out as quietly as she'd come. Henley shut the door, bolting it firm. He turned to Sarah, face grave. "You see? The noose tightens. Even friends who'd help must whisper." Sarah lifted the basket lid, the warm scent of broth rising. "Let them whisper. So long as she breathes, I'll bear it." That evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, Elena woke again. Stronger this time, though her face was pale, her eyes sharp. She reached for Sarah, and their hands clasped tight. "Whatever comes," Elena whispered, "we face it together." Sarah bent low, pressing her forehead to hers. Together, always. But outside, far down the road, the faint roll of a drum echoed, a sound that carried warning of soldiers drawing near once more. Night fell fast, swallowing the desert in a hard black that made the cabin feel smaller, warmer, and yet more fragile. Sarah sat by the fire, rocking Elena in her lap. The baby was finally dozing again, her tiny body curled against Sarah like a living flame. Henley moved about the cabin quietly, preparing a tincture of herbs to help strengthen Elena's lungs. His hands were steady, though his face bore lines of worry. "Fever's broken, but that doesn't mean the danger's gone," he murmured. "I know," Sarah whispered. She brushed a stray lock of hair from Elena's forehead. "Every day it's the same. Waiting." Watching, Henley leaned against the counter, his gaze thoughtful. "You can't stay here forever. Soldiers, rumors, neighbors who talk. One day it'll be more than whispers. You'll have to make a choice." Sarah's lips pressed together, tight with determination. "Then we'll make it a choice that keeps her alive. That's all that matters." A sudden sound outside made them both freeze. Snow had begun again, lightly at first, dusting the ground like powdered sugar. But the creak of hooves, uneven and cautious, was unmistakable. Someone was coming. Henley grabbed his rifle again. "Stay low," he ordered. Sarah held Elena close, the baby stirring slightly. "Who is it?" she asked quietly. Henley didn't answer. He opened the door a crack and peered out. Moonlight reflected off the brim of a single rider, who sat hunched in the saddle, horse-pawing nervously at the snow. "Show yourself!" Henley called, his voice commanding. The figure shifted. Slowly, deliberately, a hand lifted from the reins. A young man's face emerged, snow-dusted and tense. Recognition struck Sarah immediately. "Private?" "From the fort?" she whispered, disbelief coloring her tone. The rider nodded. I couldn't sleep. I had to know. That baby, you're keeping her safe." Sarah blinked, unsure whether to trust him. Henley lowered the rifle slightly, study lingering in his gaze. "I couldn't turn away," the young soldier said. "I know what it's like to want to protect someone who can't protect themselves. I had a little sister once. I would have died to keep her safe too. Sarah felt tears sting her eyes. Elena stirred again, gurgling, as if hearing the sincerity in the voice outside. Henley's jaw tightened. "You know the risks," he said sharply. "If anyone finds out you've come here, you'll be in trouble too." The soldier swallowed hard. "I'll take my chances. I couldn't leave without seeing she's alive." That night the soldier stayed. He kept a quiet watch near the cabin's edge, rifle across his lap, eyes scanning the dark horizon. Sarah slept fitfully, cradling Elena, aware of the world outside, but comforted by the small presence near the window. Over the next days, the soldier became a quiet ally. He brought news from the fort, carefully selected and hushed, warning them of patrols and rumors of Apache sightings. Sarah learned to trust him without needing to speak the words aloud. He had no name for Elena beyond her given one, but he treated her like she belonged in the world, like she had a right to live freely. Winter deepened. Snowdrifts rose higher than Sarah's knees in places, and the nights stretched long and cold. They fortified the cabin as best they could, stacking firewood, sealing gaps with blankets, and cooking what supplies they had. Every day was a careful balance between survival and concealment. By mid-January, Elena had grown noticeably stronger. Her laughter returned in bursts, and she learned to walk, tentative at first, wobbling across the floor before collapsing in joyous giggles. She understood more than words could capture: signals, gestures, the rhythm of the cabin, and the subtle warning signs Sarah had taught her. If someone came too close, stay quiet, hide under blankets, or hold still like a shadow. One afternoon, Henley and Sarah sat by the fire while Elena played with a carved wooden horse. Henley's face was grave. "Sarah, it's only a matter of time before they come back," he said. "And next time they won't come alone. They'll bring reinforcements." Sarah sighed, brushing a lock of hair from her face. "Then we'll be ready. We've come this far. We'll go further." Henley studied her. "You know it's reckless, keeping her here like this?" Sarah's gaze hardened. "No, it's necessary. She's mine, my child, in every way that matters." The winter winds rose, howling across the plains like a living thing. Elena laughed, chasing the wooden horse across the floor. Sarah watched her, heart full, knowing each moment was a small rebellion against the cruelty outside. The first real test came at dawn, 2 weeks later. Snow had fallen overnight, thick and muffling the world. Hooves pounded through it, shouting carried across the frozen expanse. Sarah's heart jumped as she bolted from her bed, Elena in her arms. Henley was already at the door, rifle raised. Outside, soldiers had dismounted, fanning out across the clearing. They moved like predators, disciplined and methodical. "Quickly," Henley hissed. "We move her to the cellar." The cabin had a small underground storage, a space Sarah had once used for preserving vegetables and storing grain. She bundled Elena tightly and ducked down, Henley following close. They sank into the dark, the cold pressing in from all sides. Above, the soldiers searched. Voices called, boots scraped the wooden floorboards. Sarah held Elena's hand, whispering low, reassuring words. "Shh, Mama's here. Quiet now. Love." The soldiers' search dragged on, meticulous and frustrating. Every creak of floorboards, every faint breath sounded like a thunderclap in Sarah's ears. Hours passed, each one stretching longer than the last. At last, footsteps receded. Voices grew distant. Henley exhaled slowly, the tension leaving his shoulders just enough to betray fatigue. Sarah lifted Elena, brushing the snow-damp hair from her face. "All clear," she whispered. Elena reached for her tiny fingers curling tight. Henley placed a hand on Sarah's shoulder. "For now," he said, "but they'll return. You must prepare, hide, move, whatever it takes. This winter will test every ounce of cunning we have." Sarah nodded, determination hardening in her chest. "We'll survive it," she said. "Together." Outside, The snow glinted under the pale sun, a frozen world that could hide as easily as it could betray. Within the cabin, a small child laughed, oblivious to the dangers, and a woman held her close, vowing never to let the world steal her away. Spring crept into the desert slowly, melting the snow and leaving the land damp with mud and promise. The harsh grip of winter loosened, and Sarah could feel the pulse of life returning to the plains. Trees that had been skeletal stood tall with budding leaves, and the creek, once dry, trickled again with water that shimmered under the morning sun. Elena had grown noticeably stronger and more independent. She could walk steadily now, run short distances, and babble in ways that were almost sentences. Sarah marveled at her quick mind, her fearless curiosity, and the way she seemed to sense danger long before it arrived. The peace, however, was fragile. Sarah knew the patrols would come again, that rumors of an Apache child living with a white woman would spread faster than any snowmelt. Still, she had a plan this time. With Henley's help and the quiet guidance of the young soldier who had visited her during the blizzard, now a trusted ally, they began building a secondary hiding place, deeper in the canyon, a small dugout covered with brush and stones. Supplies could be hidden there, and in the event soldiers came looking, Elena could be moved quickly. One morning, as Sarah and Elena walked to the creek to fetch water, she paused, hand on the toddler's shoulder. "Elena, do you remember what we practiced?" Elena nodded vigorously. "Hide, Mama," she said. "Good girl." Sarah smiled, though a shadow lingered across her face. Every word she taught her, every lesson in caution, carried the weight of survival. By mid-May, the first real threat arrived. A group of soldiers from the fort, no more than 6 in number, rode through the canyon. They were clearly not on routine patrol. They were searching, moving slowly, scanning every nook and cranny. Sarah had Elena stay at the dugout while she went to meet the soldiers, alone. She carried nothing in her hands and wore the calm expression she had honed over months of deception and quiet courage. "Good morning," she said. "Looking for something in particular?" The lead sergeant eyed her sharply. "We're investigating reports of a child in the area." An Apache child. Sarah's heart skipped, but her face remained composed. "I haven't seen any children that match that description. You might want to check the creek beds or the canyon itself." The soldiers grumbled, suspicious, but unable to press further without evidence. After a tense half-hour, they rode on, leaving Sarah trembling but determined. She returned to Elena, who greeted her with a giggle and a tumble into her arms. "You're safe," Sarah whispered, holding her close. "Always safe with me." The summer that followed was one of quiet victories. Sarah, Elena, and their allies moved seamlessly between the cabin and the hidden dugout, learning to read the land, the patrols, and the patterns of human and animal movement. Elena grew into a clever, brave little girl, already showing signs of the keen intelligence that her father, the warrior, must have had. Henley continued his quiet mentorship, teaching Sarah techniques to care for Elena's health and survive in the harsh environment, and occasionally providing herbs and remedies for illnesses that crept in with changing seasons. By the time Elena turned 3, she was a whirlwind of motion, laughter, and questions that Sarah sometimes struggled to answer. "Where's my father, Mama?" she asked one evening, as the sun dipped behind the canyon walls. Sarah hugged her tightly, the weight of the truth pressing against her heart. "He was very brave," she said finally, "and he made sure you would always be safe. That's why you're here with me." Elena considered this, nodding solemnly, before turning back to play with the wooden horse Sarah had carved for her so many winters ago. The following years passed in a rhythm that was both ordinary and miraculous. Sarah taught Elena reading and writing, songs and stories, the survival skills needed for the land around them. She also honored her Apache heritage, teaching her to recognize plants, track animals, and remember the language of her people. As Elena grew older, the world's dangers never fully disappeared, but Sarah's careful planning and the quiet vigilance of her allies meant they could live without constant fear. The small community around the cabin began to respect Sarah's resolve, and eventually, the truth of her courage became quietly known. A woman who had saved and raised a child against impossible odds, and had done so with both love and unflinching defiance. When Elena reached the age of 5, she could ride a horse, cook simple meals, and navigate the canyon trails as if she had been born to the land. Her laughter carried through the trees and over the creek, a sound of joy that was impossible to contain. One summer afternoon, as Sarah and Elena sat on the porch watching the dust clouds rise in the distance, the young soldier, older now, a man hardened by war but softened by what he had seen in this little family, approached once again. "I hear the reports are finally quiet," he said, smiling faintly. "Seems the fort has given up the search." Sarah exhaled, a long, quiet release. "We did it," she whispered, looking down at Elena, who was chasing a lizard across the dry grass. "Yes," the soldier agreed, "and she's exactly where she belongs." Years would pass, children would come and go, seasons would turn, and the desert would continue to test all who lived upon it. But for Sarah and Elena, the cabin in the canyon became a sanctuary, a place where love had defied cruelty, where mercy had outweighed fear, and where a child had grown up knowing she was cherished and protected in a world that often offered neither. In the evenings, Sarah would sit with Elena on her lap, telling stories of the desert, of brave warriors, and of mothers who would never give up. Elena listened, wide-eyed, absorbing every word. And sometimes, when the wind swept through the canyon just right, she would point and say, "Mama, that's him." My father, Sarah, would nod, holding her close, feeling the past and present intertwine. "Yes, love," she would whisper, and he would be proud. The sun set over the canyon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. In the small cabin, life hummed quietly, fiercely, and beautifully. Love had carved a home out of the harsh desert. Mercy had won, and a child, once nearly lost, laughed and lived in the light of the mother who had saved her. For Sarah and Elena, the world outside could rage as it would, but within the walls of their cabin, against the rhythm of the creek and the whisper of the canyon wind, they were free. Free to grow, to love and to survive, free to live. And that was more than enough.